Right. So we are going to start modern physics, and the part of the modern physics that is there in your physics JEE syllabus is actually a very small amount. Maybe IIT JEE people and also your 12th class board syllabus people intend to just give you a taste of what's the life going to be of a student once he passes out of 12th class, and if he is really interested in actually, as the word modern physics suggests, he jumps over to the other side of physics. The side of the physics that you have been dealing with till now is called classical physics, classical theories, Newton's laws of motion, where they are applicable, and all that energy conservation. Mass was conserved till now in closed systems for us in most of the processes. So all these conventional rules, I'm not saying will be completely rubbished. They will coexist, but in extreme situations where certain experiments could not be explained using the classical theories, we needed better theories to explain them, and that is where modern physics steps in. And modern physics, branches of modern physics that you would be studying even after you pass out from your 12th class, in case you are interested and you further your studies in physics, which I would recommend. In case you find physics interesting, then if you continue studying physics, you will find it even more interesting. Okay, that is for sure. So the branches that you will be getting acquainted with in the further studies of physics would involve quantum mechanics and quantum field theories, etc., etc. And there's no limit. Okay, so all these basic introductions to physics are ancient theories that we have done till now in 12th class. They'll give you a bridge and a taste of what should be there in the future. So the future is open actually. So if you keep giving more and more part of your life to further studies, and then finally you end up at a stage, and if you are faithful enough with the subject, you'll end up at a stage where you may become the inventor. And once you um, explain something, please understand, and that's what we are going to concentrate in the starting stages of this syllabus. Once you can put forward a theory and an experimental observation which explains some of the unanswered theories in physics which are right now present, then you would get a Nobel Prize in physics. That's as simple as that, and also obviously not as simple also, because a lot of people do work over a period of decades and then they get the recognition, if at all their work actually is exemplary. Okay, so on that note, let's start off with our simple introduction to the modern physics syllabus that we are going to have in our JE part. Okay, so let's go ahead. So I broadly classified the modern physics syllabus into a flow chart like this, which we are going to deal with in the next 3 weeks. Okay. So the JEE syllabus of the modern physics is divided broadly into atomic physics and nuclear physics. And within atomic physics, we have sub branches which we'll be dealing with. We'll start off with some particle physics experiments which changed the course of physics and the thinking. These are the experiments which made people think in different directions and come out of the comfort zone of the classical theories and invent or propose new theories. So of which one of the examples is the photoelectric experiment or photoelectric emission experiment. Okay, and then we'll go on to the photon theory and matter waves, and we'll further move on to the Bohr's model of atom. Actually, before moving on to Bohr's model of atom, we'll also see other atomic models that were initially discussed. And finally, we'll wrap up the atomic physics with X-rays. Okay, so this is what our sequence of events would be. And since we can't cover everything in 1 week within our JE coaching, what we'll do is we'll take a first week, that is modern physics part 1, as these two parts. The second week would be devoted to these two, and the third week would be completely devoted to nuclear physics. So that's what we are going to deal with. So this is going to be your week 1 syllabus. Okay, right, or part 1. So let's move on, and we'll start off with some basic introduction. If you have taken a snapshot already. Okay, so because there were so many experiments being done almost at the close of 19th century, we will not be able to take all of them. So whatever are given in NCERT, I will highlight them because the sequence of those events will start even developing interest in us to understand how the things went about. Okay, so you need not remember all the scientists' names, all the physicists' names, all the years and all. The years are written only here for your conceptual and or for your understanding of how the things went in sequence. And some pages would also not follow the chronological order. You should realize that some of the experiments were done simultaneously by different people. The work was being done on similar experiment by two different people in two different ways. So there could be a way, the way I have planned the lecture, it need not be in the order of events that have appeared. Okay, right. So the first basic intro is that we should acknowledge Maxwell's equations and the Hertz experiments, which led to, let me write it there on the side. These two, what they did, they established EM waves and electromagnetic waves. EM waves means electromagnetic waves and wave nature of light. Maxwell's equation was a theoretical thing, and Hertz performed experiments to actually confirm Maxwell's equations, how it can be applied to light. So by the end of these experiments, okay, or 1880s as you could call it, if someone refers to wave nature of light in that scenario, he's talking about electromagnetic wave nature. We're not talking about Huygens wave theory. We are talking about EM wave theory. Okay, so we'll discuss in that context light to be electromagnetic wave. So electric field and magnetic field are mutually perpendicular to each other in a transverse manner to the direction of propagation, and they are in phase with each other. So we did discuss all these things in EM waves extra syllabus topic. Okay, so we'll revise all those things in second year. Don't worry about them. But at this point, when someone asked anyone what is light, they used to say it is a wave, and what nature of that wave is described as it's electromagnetic wave. Okay, but during these experiments, what happened was something accidental, as is the case with most of the breakthrough theories in physics. Hertz experiments, which were performed to establish the wave nature of light, gave rise to some observations which were slightly surprising to him. So let's write down what in that experiment he saw. Okay, so in his experiment on production of EM waves by means of a spark discharge. This spark discharge, I think during our electrostatics chapter, I also discussed this. It's also known as corona discharge. I know you will be very uncomfortable hearing the word corona right now, but this was actually used for the discharge in this experiment much before the virus came. Okay, and the idea of any word corona is used when there is a spike or when there is a sharp edge. Okay, actually the virus that we are right now looking at in the outside world, when you are watching it at microscopic level, has that kind of spikes on it, and that's why the name corona. Okay, right. So yeah, so in this context it's called as corona discharge. Hertz observed that Hertz observed that HV means high voltage sparks, across the detector loop. I'll draw the diagram, don't worry. Across the detector loop were enhanced when UV was entered. UV was incident on emitter plate. Okay, let me show you a picture of that and we'll come back and see what he concluded from that. Okay, so this was what he observed. Okay, let's see the observation in the picture and then we'll come back and write what's the conclusion here. Okay, once the lecture is ended, I will put forward some videos to you to see how the experiment was running, and that will give you even better picture. And when I upload this lecture into YouTube, I'll post that link of the video of this Hertz observation in the description below. Okay, so see. Okay, so this was the Hertz observation when he did this experiment. You can take a snapshot of it as of now, and all of this is mentioned even in your NCRT reading without the diagram. Okay, so I've just given you the diagram. So even though here it has been shown as a very round edge, this actually would be slightly sharpened edges. Initial diagram was by taking spheres because he never intended to have the final observation that he got, but the modern experiment that is done to again recapture this result is done with this spheres being sharp edges. Okay, that's why the word corona I used. Okay, so what happens is when you pass a current through this and these spheres are brought very close to each other, there will be a large potential difference developed across these two in a small gap. Large potential difference in a small gap means very large electric field, and the air here will get ionized and there will be a discharge sparks that would be flying from here to here. Okay, right. Since these discharge sparks are nothing but light and electromagnetic radiation, without any connection between this and a loop that was placed far away from it in a direction perpendicular to that. You could see this line of that loop is perpendicular to this direction of action. Okay, so but he said that light will be emitted in all directions, and that's what he was trying to prove in electromagnetic wave radiation. Okay, so the light which went like this, okay, the light which went like this also induced an EMF here. Remember, if light goes like this, EM wave radiation tells you that there is an electric field perpendicular to that light, and that electric field is propagated and reaches this metal loop. And again, there will be a discharge here also. So the intended discharge was here, whereas the discharge that he got was here. Okay, so that's why he said electromagnetic waves can be propagated in space, and therefore by having an antenna at some other position, the waves can be sent and signals can be sent. That's what was his intention. Okay, his intention was that, but he saw something else. He said that this discharge was enhanced, that means increased, when UV light is made to fall on this one. Okay, what is meant by discharge? Discharge means free electrons moving from one place to another place. That discharge was supposed to be due to only this spark, right? But he got extra values of discharge, extra amount of discharge when UV light was incident on this part. Okay, initially he was actually doing this entire experiment in a very dark room. Okay, so accidentally when UV light started falling on this particular part, dark means visibly dark, but UV light was there as a part of the experimental laboratory setup. So that UV light, whenever it was falling on it, he was getting wrong values that he was supposed to get from EM wave theory. So the EM wave theory was giving wrong calculations. So he thought there is some extra thing that is happening whenever light falls on this separately, UV light separately falls from outside, there is enhancement of the radiation that is coming out, or the electrons coming out from here to here. That's what he never knew, even word electron. I am now saying it is electron because we know that he thought some charges are being discharged. Okay, 1887, electron was not yet discovered. Okay, so let's go back and let's write the conclusion he made. So he concluded UV falling on the metal loop, metal, it's not complete loop, okay, metal loop sphere facilitated the electron discharge. Okay, it's not exactly his words, I am just putting some this thing. So you should realize that electrons were not known at that time. He said some charges are coming out. So he said some free charges are coming out. And this effect was later named as, this effect was later after the electron discovery and all that. Photoelectric effect. It's a futuristic term for them. Okay, photon, when it is falling, that is light is falling, electrons are coming out. That's why photoelectric effect. So this is a future name. Okay, just take a snapshot of this and the next page, that picture also you can have a. Okay, right. Right. So you should also remember in our textbooks we have limited space. Okay, so there are many other people who did observe photoelectric effect even before Hertz, but the conclusions and the patents, all those things also matter, right? So we in no way are going to say that others didn't do any work, but whatever is given in NCERT, I'm highlighting those. Okay, so it is very interesting to actually read into the history of that time, somewhere around 1850s onwards to till 1950s. That 100 years, including the world wars, would be one of the most fascinating periods to understand. If you go through the history of science, you will understand the science also much better, how people were thinking at that time and all that. So we don't have much time to cover all that, but I would request you, whenever you get time later, in your free time, and if you are still interested, that is one part which you can actually even visit some documentaries in your YouTube channels and all that. It would be really, really nice. Okay, so let's move on. Next important observations that your NCERT highlights is of these two people, Leonard and Hallwash observations, and these are panning out in a completely large period of time. As you could see, it's around 1886 to 1902. Okay, so let's start with the Leonard's observations. Okay, so Leonard's simple experiment was this, wherein he was using a carbon arc light of variable intensity. Carbon arc light of variable intensity. He was making it pass through a quartz window. Okay, right. So that means this quartz window will actually only allow certain frequencies of light that he wants. Rest of them, they will be absorbed, and that selected frequencies that he knows now that are falling on a metal plate, which he calls as anode, and is then whatever photoelectric effect that the in the previous page we discussed would be happening. That means this light will fall on it and some free charges were coming out. Again, they did not know it was electrons. Now we are calling them as photoelectrons, and they will be actually going and getting collected by this end of the material, which is going to be called as cathode. You can also call this as a collector cup. Okay, and these electrons flowing towards right can be enhanced in order to observe. Okay, it can be enhanced, that flow can be enhanced by applying an electric field like this. Look at the diagram. I'm putting an extra electric field. You could see electric field applied in this direction is good for electrons moving towards right. How can you apply this electric field? By applying a voltage outside. You can you see a variable voltage that can be applied with this as the positive plate and this as the negative plate. Okay, right. So that you can, this is variable both in magnitude and direction. Polarity also can be varied. Okay, so you can increase the movement of electrons and collection here, or decrease it by changing the polarity and magnitude of this variable voltage. Okay, and why are we doing this? In order to make sure that there is a closed loop of flow, and this ammeter is going to register that current. You can't see electrons with your naked eye. Only way to register them is to see it in ammeter. Okay, so that's what he was trying to observe. Okay, so these are his discoveries during this particular experiment. So he discovered that the particles emitted by metal on exposure to light were negatively charged. Okay, he said that these particular particles would be negatively charged. They were identical to the electrons discovered in by the J.J. Thomson's experiments also. Okay, so J.J. Thomson experiment for that cathode ray tube, CRT. Okay, so let me write that. So it was in cathode ray tube, CRT. So they were similar to the electrons that were discovered in cathode ray tube. contrary to the belief at that time, he found that the kinetic energy of the emitted electrons does not depend on the intensity of light. What is the belief related to? Let me underline that part. This belief was based on the theory of waves. Okay, so if light was a wave theory, okay, light was let's say wave related theory. That theory suggested that this kinetic energy of these emitted electrons coming out should depend on intensity. That means you make this light more and more intense, the electrons should come out with greater kinetic energy. But during his experimental results, he found that it didn't depend on the intensity. The Ke of the emitted photoelectrons, he found it was not dependent on the intensity of light that was used. Okay, so that was another observation or discovery he made. A brighter light only increased the number of electrons emitted. Brighter word is always used for intensity, right? So whenever someone says brighter light, it means more intensity light. Okay, so that only increased the number of electrons emitted. So what was the belief? Ke should increase of each electron. That didn't happen, but instead more number of electrons are emitted with same Ke. Okay, so if you increase the intensity here, if capital N was the previous number of electrons, the new number was higher. The new number was higher. So he discovered that the energy in the emitted electrons increased with the frequency of the light. So there is two different things. Intensity means how many number of photons per unit volume are there inside this. That is the intensity. Whereas the frequency is the wavelength associated or the quality associated, red light or UV light, that discusses the wavelength or the frequency. So he saw that the kinetic energy of these things are increased with the frequency and not the intensity. So these are two very important things which were contrary to the belief at that particular time. Okay, right. So this was the observation Lenard did. Okay, so just take a picture of this. Same thing your NCERT mentions. I just elaborated it a bit. Okay, right. Let's move forward. Let's see what Halvor's experiment discussed. Okay, Halvor's setup was a similar one during that period, but he used a gold leaf electroscope, okay, right, to observe the same thing. So you could see that when he took a zinc plate, let me label that in the picture itself. So this was the zinc plate. Can you see on the top I'm writing here? So any zinc plate which was originally, let's say, charged plus or minus, look at this, this is either a plus charge zinc plate or a minus charge zinc plate, it didn't matter. When we was using red colored light, that is of certain wavelength, and light was or laser was falling on it, already when these two, when charge was there on the plate, you could see the leaves of the electroscope were apart, showing some deflection. Okay, and when he made red laser light incident on this, he saw that the deflection never changed. There was no effect on it. Okay, right. Another thing that he also saw that when, let's come to the third picture. Look here. Okay, when the zinc plate was negatively charged, can you see the minus sign here? The zinc plate was negatively charged. Then if he focused a ultraviolet light onto that zinc plate, okay, the deflection reduced, the leaf fell immediately, the leaves actually came together immediately. This was the observation he made. Okay, so let's label them not in the picture order. This, let's say, is observation 1 with red light, and let's say is observation 2 with the UV light. We'll come back to this, we'll talk about this. Okay, right. So same thing he's showing it here. Okay, so gold leaf electroscope. If the zinc plate was, let's say, positively charged initially, and you are having a positive charge zinc plate. So here this was with the negative charge. Okay, right. Now I'm explaining it here. If the zinc plate was positively charged, the gold leaves are apart, and then he gave the UV light, let's suppose, onto it. Okay, he gave UV light onto it, then the electrons are going to leave this particular plate, and you are going to have the leaves actually coming apart from it. Okay, so let me write this one. This is, let's say, neutral let's write neutral. Okay, that's our observation 3. Neutral plate initially. So let's say this is observation 3. We'll go back to the upper picture next. Okay, so if I take a neutral plate and I incident a UV light, let's say this is UV light on the zinc plate. Initially, you could see the leaves are close to each other because this is neutral plate, and something happened once the UV light actually fell on it, and now we know that electrons actually left. Leaving of electrons from a neutral plate causes a positive charge throughout, right? And the leaves actually come apart, right? And if you put that UV light continuously now, this is the fourth observation. Okay, I couldn't get the diagrams in sequence, so that's why I'm writing the observations in sequence here. This is observation 4. Once the positive charge has reached certain saturated value and you keep introducing the UV light continuously onto it, in the observation 4, he saw that whatever maximum deflection was there, it continued staying the same value. Okay, right. So that means there was a limit to which this particular plate could lose out on the electrons. So these are the 4 observations that he saw using a gold leaf electroscope. So very quickly, let me write all those things. UV light was made incident on a zinc plate of gold leaf electroscope. Okay, gold leaf electroscope, and it caused divergence of leaves. If he repeated this experiment, with an initially negatively charged. Previously it was, let's say, a neutral one, divergence came into account. That was the observation 3 I wrote here. Okay, so but if he repeated this experiment with an initially negatively charged zinc plate, the divergence decreased. No effect was seen in both cases with visible light or red light. In both the cases, whether it is negative charge or positive charge, this was what I'm talking about. So what would be the conclusion? If the physicist has some common sense, he would say, in all the cases, they will do all the possible experiments and they will say that UV light, when it falls on a zinc plate, some negative charges are coming out. UV light facilitates ejection of, now we are using the word, at that time he just said negative charge, ejection of photoelectrons from zinc plate. So it was dependent on the frequency, and certain frequency light only did that and other frequency light didn't. That's the conclusion he made. Okay, so just take a snapshot of this. This was somewhere, just to keep it clear for you, it was somewhere around, I think, 1888. So right after Leonard started his work. Next one, they both actually got together then, and then they started working on some other setup. And instead of using zinc, only. They worked on zinc, cadmium, and magnesium, and they responded only to UV. While the 1A metals, that is the alkali metals, they were sensitive to even visible light. So why will a scientist or a physicist do this? They wanted to know whether UV has special properties or not. Is it ultraviolet light that is causing all of this, or is it something else? Is it the combination of the light versus the metal that they wanted to check? Okay, so they worked together and found that metals like zinc, cadmium, and magnesium responded only to responded only to UV, while while 1A metals, that is alkali metals, were sensitive. Sensitive means they are ejecting photoelectrons. Were sensitive even to visible electromagnetic radiation. They still were calling it electromagnetic radiation. Okay. All these photosensitive, they started calling them photosensitive substances emitted negatively charged particles, negatively charged particles upon illumination with a certain frequency of light. It was not about brightness, it was more about the frequency of light. So this was another conclusion they made. After the discovery of electron by J.J. Thomson in 1897, these were called photoelectrons. Okay, Leonard continued to work even after 1890s. He continued to work. So after discovery of electron by J.J. Thomson in somewhere around 1897, I guess, these particles were called photoelectrons. And the phenomena observed was called photoelectric emission effect or photoelectric effect. Okay, so just a small note, just to have a chronology here. When all of this was happening, discovery and all of these things were happening, there was another separate chapter being written in physics at a different place, and we should note, because this is also part of our syllabus, a week later, X-rays were discovered. It was very exciting time to be a physicist at that time, especially with no Facebook and all those. So people did not know what works were going on. They always used to know once the discoveries were made. Okay, so this was done somewhere around in 1895. This was also going to be a part of our syllabus later on, and how this also influenced all of this we would be slightly looking at in the next week. So X-rays were also getting discovered at this point of time. Accident. X-rays were also an accident. Okay, so just take a snapshot. We'll move on to the J.J. Thomson experiments. Okay, right, let's move on. So his experiments were based on the cathode ray tube experiments. Okay, he initially discovered cathode rays. He actually, I don't think, named the word electron. Electron word was coined by someone else, but he discovered that atoms contain negatively charged particles, and those particles are independent of the type of atom. That means whether you are looking at magnesium, it contains negatively charged particles, and sodium also contains similar looking negatively charged particles. Okay, so let's see what it is actual picture of him working on the cathode ray tube that he modified. Actually, cathode ray tubes were available even before his time, but he modified them in order to suit his observations. So let's see certain observations he made. So this is a schematic diagram for those who are interested in how a CRT works. Okay, so there will be always some metal pins outside, and there will be a part. You could see a sharp edge where you would be heating that, and these electrons would be discharged out. Okay, when you heat a substance and a sharp edge is there, that particular part, the electrons would be coming, like the corona discharge I was trying to talk about. But this type of discharge is called thermionic emission. When you heat a material and electrons are discharged from it, that type of discharge is called thermionic emission. Okay, the actual CRT on which J.J. Thomson work did not have this. This is a modified version of it. He was using some cold mechanism. Okay, so this is a heated discharge that he's doing. So once these electrons come out, they will be accelerated using some electric field. So all these things that you need not remember are just there to accelerate the electrons, and these parts will ensure that the electrons will be emitted actually in all directions, but they will be made to move in one particular direction using all this arrangement. So finally, once the electrons come out here, there will be a collimated beam. Okay, so you need something called as a collimated beam of electrons. This word, whenever you see either in light or matter waves, we assume that the beam is very thin and it's only moving in one particular direction. Okay, so those rays in those days was called cathode rays. And then you'll do something with that beam in 3 different experiments. We'll look at them very quickly, right? And they will apply some electric field, will apply some magnetic field, and will apply both in the third experiment to do some results. Okay, so by the time they reach the other end of the tube, this would be a phosphorescent screen on which scintillations would be produced. Electron, whenever it hits, it produces a scintillation at that place. From that we know that electron has hit at that position. We can't see electron, but we'll be able to see its interaction with this screen. Okay, so that's the basic idea of a schematic of CRT, cathode ray tube. Just take a picture, we'll move forward. Okay, right. So let's see experiment 1. So in experiment 1, what he did was he applied magnetic field to it. Cathode rays bent or deviated upon application of magnetic field. So let me write that. So only magnetic field was applied. So let me give you a simple explanation. So between these two positions, there will be some electrons that would be sent using all that mechanism I said. And if there was no magnetic field provided here, they would have gone straight. Instead, by producing a magnetic field in this region, the electrons are supposed to bend like this. Okay, so there will be some slits. The slits are strategically placed in such a way that only if magnetic field is there, the electrons will go through them and come into this region, and they will be detected at this place using some electrometer. Electrometer is a meter which detects the number of electrons falling on it per unit time, which is nothing but detecting current. So these deviations are set in such a way that you will be able to estimate the value of B for these deviations, assuming the charge and mass of that particular electron. He didn't know what's the value of charge or mass, so he was alternatively changing this value of B. By knowing this value of B, he will be able to know the charge and mass ratio of this electrons. Okay, right. So this was the first experiment. And moreover, he repeated the experiment with different materials and gases. So there was gas always, remember, inside this particular cylinder or whatever, bell jar, as you can call it, there you can put different gases. And the materials that he has used at the other end to produce the scintillations, and also the materials that he used for the thermionic emission. Remember in the previous schematic, this heated material can be changed from one to another substance. So he performed that, and he found the deflection of these rays was same irrespective of materials and gases used. His entire idea or the conclusion was these cathode rays are independent of the material that is being used in the CRT. So that was his conclusion. Okay, this was from experiment 1. So experiment 1 involves only use of B bar. So take a snapshot, we're moving forward. Experiment 2 was even a more famous one where he applied electric field. Okay, so we are back to the diagram where if these are cathode rays or beam of electrons that now we know, you could see a capacitor was placed here, right? Plus and minus. So electric field is downward. If electric field is downward and if the deflection of the beam happens in opposite direction, then we know the beam contains negatively charged particles, and that's what he observed. Okay, he knew that these cathode rays are charged particles. Okay, then he knew that they are charged particles, and not only that, he now is able to ascertain from both experiment 1 and 2 that they are negatively charged particles. You could see the deviation happens only up till the position here. It was very difficult for him to measure this deviation. So what he did is he scaled that deviation. Okay, so you could see that you can extend the straight line, and whatever angle that you get here would be the same angle at this particular position. So this was a idea that was unique to his CRT. The old CRTs that were used by physicists in the past did not have this scaling method. Okay, so he was able to enlarge this and measure this more accurately, and by knowing the value of electric field, therefore he can estimate the value of charge to mass ratio of these particles that are coming out. Okay, so this dotted line represented the positioning of the scintillation when cathode rays were in the absence of the electric field, and with the presence of electric field, this red colored part was seen. Okay, right. So cathode rays, what did he see? Cathode rays bent and deviated in the presence of electric field. Now E bar. Okay, and using a scaling method, he could measure the deviation for a given E. Okay, so that was okay. Now, one of the other things that he found, which this is just for your information, that the CRT experiments were also done by Hertz also, the same person who started all of this. So Hertz CRT methods were a failure because he could not find any deviation like this. He could not find any deviation. The primary flaw in the CRT methods used by Hertz was the gas that was introduced inside was very high pressure gas. Okay, so let me write on the side. Hertz CRTs had high pressure. So if someone, and this was a question once asked in KVPY, uh, J.J. Thomson's CRT used low pressure gases, and why was the low pressure very important? That means if this was a vacuum kind of a situation, then these deviations were better observed. The idea is whenever you have gases at high pressure, then these fast moving electrons, remember you accelerate these electrons in this region, they hit the air molecules or whatever gas molecules and they ionize them. And these ionized molecules create a space charge and create a shielding effect around this. So this electric field, it's almost like an ionized space volume, right? It's almost like a charged volume of gas. And whenever you have a charged volume of gas, it's like a conducting volume. Inside that conducting volume, there'll be some polarization that takes place, and whatever external electric field that you are applying, it will be cancelled out. You remember from our electrostatics situations, if you have a conducting space charge volume and you apply an electric field outside, the polarization inside will be taken in opposite direction, and finally E net inside will be made zero. So these electrons which are coming next will have to pass through that region, and they will pass through undeviated because the E net has been created by this ionized charges. Okay, so this was to avoid, low pressure was very important to avoid ionization of gases inside. Ionization of gas inside by cathode rays. And that's where J.J. Thomson's CRT experiments were a hit, as compared to Hertz. But the idea he got from a Hertz only. So these are the 2 points you need to know in this part of the experiment. Okay, next. Let's just take a snapshot of this. I think this should be better. Okay, let's move forward to the third and the final experiment. So in the final experiment, what he did was he simultaneously applied an electric and magnetic field. You see, I copied the same diagram from the previous experiment too, and you could see the deviation has been negated by applying an electric field. North and south poles are placed of a magnet, so magnetic field is into the plane, okay, and that cancels out the effect of the electric field. Okay, right. So when both are present, cathode rays, when electric force equals magnetic force, that is QE is equal to B QVB. Remember, Lorentz force is 0, and that is when this red colored happened. Okay, right. So that's the third important experiment that he did. And so what did he note finally? Let's check that one out. Just to save time, I've written things down already. So let me highlight them for you. So this is what his conclusion was. So he noted that his calculated value, and this is the equation that he wrote. He did not initially intend to write charge to mass. He wrote mass to charge actually. Okay, so m by e that he calculated from this theta that he got here was b square l e by theta. This you can easily write actually. In the small electric field part here, the deviation can be calculated like almost this is like a projectile motion, right? That from that previous experiment. So that theta can be calculated, and you can substitute E is equal to BV in that, and you will end up getting this simple looking expression. Okay, right? So you could see on the right hand side, he saw that this number did not change for a given value of B, E, and L. Okay, given value of B, E, and L. What is L? L is the length of this scaled number. Okay, this particular part through which it has been scaled, or deviation part here. Okay, uh, L is the length of the capacitor. So that was also not changed. So for a given field, given E, given length, the same theta was observed by him even if he changed the materials. That's what he saw. So therefore this, he said, was unique for all materials. So he noted that this calculated value of m by e was independent of the gas in the discharge tube and the metal used as the cathode. This also gave an indication that particles were an integral part of atoms. Okay, so inside the atoms, these electrons or these particles should be there, and that's what he said. Only mistake he made at that point of time when he was giving his paper or the theory to the world is he further said these were the two correct conclusions. Okay, independent of gas and metal, and these particles called electrons are going to be integral part of atoms. The mistake or the limitation of his theory was he said atoms should be made only of these. Okay, so let me write that limitation. His conclusion that atom constituted, or it is made up of, only electrons, which was later disproved. Ironically, it is disproved by his own student called Rutherford. Rutherford alpha ray scattering experiment discusses the presence of nucleus, right? So it's not a bad thing. It teaches us something, right? A teacher can be wrong, and but teacher's insight actually gives a student a motivation to actually go ahead and perform a better experiment. And in all of this, science wins. discovery of nucleus disproved this. Okay, right. So let me zoom out so that you can take a snapshot of this. This is the experiment 3. Okay, right. Let's move forward. The next important experiment in this system was, I've just skipped the Rutherford alpha ray scattering experiment and Bohr's model because that's our next week. I said everything won't be in chronology. It will be based on our syllabus also. So we have jumped to 1913 now. Okay, and all of this ended a bit later, and then Leonard's work was continuing after this 1897 part, and then Einstein also comes along in 1905. So we'll jump back to that period. Okay, so we now go on to Millikan's oil drop experiment. Okay, so let's see what that experiment showed us. So this was very important because this showed the charge of electron is a quantized quantity, or the charge of electron is the primary charge, and it's going to be proving that quantization of charge at the subatomic level. Okay, so let me write that. This showed that charge of electron is equal to 1.602 into 10 power 19 and proved that any charge a system possesses is quantized. So if someone asks you in a KVPY interview, which was the experiment which proved quantization of charge, you would quote Millikan's oil drop experiment. Most of your KVPY interview questions would be based on modern physics. Most. Okay, yeah, they will ask mechanics and all that, but they would be really interested in how much you have learned beyond the textbook. Also, they'll ask. Okay, so quantized multiples of E, as we call it. So let's try to go through how he performed the experiment very quickly. Okay, so what he did is he sent some. There are many versions of this. I am explaining one of them. Okay, so he sent, this is an atomizer or a spray. So this is oil. Okay, oil is sprayed into this particular chamber that he's using, and these sprayed oil charges or particles are made to pass through a perforation or a hole here of a charged metal plate. So as they pass through, due to their different times of sizes that they have, all these are randomly generated drops, right? So he's not taking any effort or making any effort to create unique size droplets, so different random sizes. So their random times of interactions, by the time they pass into the second chamber, each of these drops has different masses and different values of charges, and therefore they would be having q values which are different things. Okay, and as these are going to pass through this particular charge or particular chamber, they will be acted upon by some forces. Okay, so these will be acted upon by some forces. The two forces that are initially observed are weight and air resistance, which he says, listen carefully to this, since these are oil drops and they, when left on their own, acquire spherical shape, he said he can use Stokes law. Remember Stokes law of viscosity? Air resistance he assumed to be proportional to velocity. Remember K times V. To be more precise, 6 pi eta RV. Stokes law tells you that the viscous force acting on them due to air resistance would be 6 pi eta RV. That's the reason why he chose the spherical droplets. Okay, so he drew two free body diagrams. Let me draw that, case 1 and case 2 on the sideline. This was a very patient work actually done by him over a period of more than 5 years actually. So this was, let's say, case 1 and case 2. In two cases he observed. The first case was each oil drop, I'm showing it with yellow dot, would be having only two forces acting on it, and they acquire terminal velocity very quickly. Okay. So in case one, what we'll do is we'll apply electric field. So this picture is by applying electric field. You could see electric field is actually downward. No? You could see positive terminal up, negative terminal down. So electric field is downward. So on these charges, which are actually negatively charged particles, let's suppose, or whatever it is, it depends on the direction of electric field. So here it might look like it is actually downward, but in his idea, he took the value of QE in one particular direction. So in my case one, I am assuming QE is in the upward direction. It can be downward also. He did experiments for both the types of charges. Okay. So with that confidence, I'll write two forces acting on it in case one in the presence of electric field, which is QE and KV1, and acceleration is 0. They will acquire terminal velocity very quickly, small size drops. In the second case, he switched off the electric field and he found that terminal velocity achieved by different size drops was a different value. So this would be mg, and a kv2 was achieved. Okay, right. So in case one, he wrote mg is equal to QE plus kv1. E can be positive or negative. And in case 2, he wrote mg is equal to kv2. By watching them through a viewing microscope, he was able to actually measure the size of the drops also. So if similar size drops were observed in each of these, then you could rearrange the two equations and write. So you should understand how much patience he had. Okay, so you could rearrange these two and write a simple looking equation that would be common and would be V2 minus V1 divided by E that he was applying. Okay, so remember carefully, the value of V2 was easily calculatable. The value of V1 would be easily, he will just watch it over a period of time. They will be falling nicely and slowly. He would take the readings of distance traveled per unit time, and then he'll say V2 value and V1 value. Okay, he's talking about a microscope here. And the value of K can be measured using the size of the drops, and K value will be different. Different drops will have different sizes, but the E that he was using was same throughout the for all the drops. So by getting different Ks and different V2s and different V1s, he found a list of charge values. Okay, so this became a list. Okay, so he prepared a list of Q values. A list of Q values were prepared. Okay, right. And he found that GCD of this list is E is equal to 1. He actually said 1.59 something. Okay, so we are the modification of this experiment was done with more accuracy, but he came very close. Okay, 1.59 in those days. I'll show you the equipment that he used, real photograph. You should understand how it looks like. The present picture that I took from encyclopedia is looking very posh. Okay, so approximately, I'll write minus 19 coulomb tells you that however the sizes change, the value of Q is multiples of E only. That's what the final experiment concluded. Greatest common divisor. So till people find in any other experiment, they found the GCD to be smaller. That means it is made up of smaller charge. This theory will hold. That's how theories work in modern physics. Till a better theory comes, we accept the older theory. Okay, so I'll just zoom out so that you can take a snapshot of this. Okay, just to show you the kind of equipment he was working on, this is a picture I got from some archive. So this is the actual, you could see atomizer. He was pressing this so that the oil drops go into the top of the chamber. Okay, so you can see the viewing microscope here and here. Okay, right, and a lot of other things that you see this. So this was in early 1900s. Millikan's oil drop experiment is in the top 10 list of the most beautiful experiments ever done. Okay, right. So this is like one of the biggest breakthroughs. Even till now, it is considered like that. And to tell you the importance of this, again, this person doesn't get this oil drop idea immediately. Thomson was doing experiments with water drops. And the water drops, if used in this kind of an environment, would have evaporated even before the observation. So always people take inspiration from the others previously done work. That's why you need to learn the previously done work. You can't say I'll be only the person who will be creative. Learning something that has been done before and respecting them is one of the first steps to become creative. So he modified that water drops that Thomson was using. Thomson modified someone else's, right? Rutherford modified someone else's. So all these modern physics experiments not only teaches us physics, but also the way of life and way of thinking of a physicist. No ego, I think you will go farther. Okay, right. And if someone copying is actually not a good word to use, you should use the word inspiration. So you should get inspired by the previously done work and try to see how better you can do it. Okay, so this was one of those examples. Let's move forward. Now we are much closer to the photoelectric effect. Okay, so we'll jump back a bit. Okay, that was 1913 experiment. So while Millikan was doing the quantization of charge experiments, things were going on and great things were going on. So to understand photoelectric effect and its explanation by Einstein in 1905, he published a paper on the explanation for photoelectric effect. Um, we need to understand what are the other types of electron emissions also. Okay, so these are the four basic methods of producing electronic emission. That means electrons being emitted out of a substance. Okay, right. The first one we have already seen in CRT. Okay, modern CRT, I'll write. Where you heat a substance, electrons come out, it's called thermionic emission. You know the photoelectric emission, which we are going to study in detail now. The secondary emission and field emission, we'll discuss these also. Very quick definitions I'll give, and we'll only focus, our main focus should be on this one during this week. Okay, but you should know the names also. That's the reason why we take up this. Just take a quick snapshot, we'll move forward. Okay, quick pictures of each one to explain. So thermionic emission is a case where you heat a substance and the electrons come out. That's called thermionic emission. So we'll write one sentence for each picture and then we'll move on. So in this case, a metal usually when heated electrons electrons come out. Okay, instead of the word ejected, I should use the word come out due to increase in their kinetic energy. They will be moving with some kinetic energy increase, inside the material. And once you heat substance, you provide them more random kinetic energy, right? And due to which they actually break the barrier and they come out into the outside world. There is a function called as work function which decides that barrier. Work function is like a toll fee. I'll write it on the top. Okay, so work function is a function which is measured in electron volt, it's like a toll fee. You have toll gates on highways, right? You go with a car or a bike or anything, right? They have a toll gate and you have to pay a fee to go on to the other side. So you should see work function as a toll fee that electron has to pay in order to come out of the material. Okay, so whatever energy that kinetic energy that it is having, this should be greater than the toll fee. Okay, so I'll use a symbol for work function that I'll use throughout the topic consistently. Phi naught is the symbol that I'll use in our classwork. So increase in their KE. So if this KE is greater than phi naught, electrons come out. Okay. And one very important thing, because we'll be using this thermionic emission in X-rays next week. So one point that you need to remember for next week is all electrons are emitted if this entire material is uniformly heated. I'm talking about uniform heating. All the electrons emitted would be almost having negligible kinetic energy. Okay. We'll discuss that later. Okay, or emitted will have negligible KE when they come out. They just trickle out when they come out. Okay, so this is the idea of thermionic emission, the first in that list. Okay, just take a quick picture. We'll move on to the field emission next. Okay, right. This field emission idea was used by the old CRT tube of, remember that I already discussed that in the J.J. Thomson's cathode ray tube, right? Used in old CRT cathode ray tube experiments by J.J. Thomson. So in this, what actually happens is, can you see that if you apply an electric field between, or this is like a corona discharge that I was talking about. Let me draw a separate picture like this. So if you have a sharp metal edge like this, and you apply an electric field, like this, then the free electrons here would start having force in the opposite direction, and from the sharper edges they have better chances to come out. Okay, so applying a very strong field ejects the electrons. So that's why it's called field emission. Applying a field to emit electrons is called field emission. And that's what is illustrated. You can see there's no heating effect done. You just apply some electric field to the sharp edged spots and electrons to come out. And the type of electric field, why this is not used in normal situations, is the strong values of this field that are usually required. E strong, just to give you an idea, is at least of the order of 10 power 8 volt per meter. Very high fields are required. Okay, right. There are governing laws for even these also. There'll be equations in your higher level physics chapters. They'll write some equations for what temperature, how many electrons per unit volume come out. All those equations are there, but they are not in the JEE syllabus. So whenever you're reading some part and you find equations describing this, you just have a smile, go through that equation, but don't remember them. If at all anything is there in JEE syllabus, I'll write that equation here. If I'm not writing it, it's not part of your JEE syllabus. Okay, it's obvious that that equation should tell us that the number of electrons coming out should be related to temperature of this material. Similarly, the equation that would be governing the field emission here Right. Just for those people who want the name, it's called Richardman reaction or equation, so not reaction. Richardman-Dashman reaction, RD equation that we talk about, and this also would be governed by a equation which will depend on the field that is applied. No need to remember any of those. Just have a watch when you are reading and then go forward. So the third one is called secondary emission. So this is where you have free electrons inside a metal. So just imagine a substance like this where free electrons are there, and you have electrons coming from outside. Okay, right. So instead of photons incident, now imagine high-speed electrons are incidents on the materials. Electrons collide and they bring out the electrons. Okay, right. And since these are called primary electrons, the ones which were used originally, and the electrons which are coming out are called secondary electrons. That's why the emission is called secondary emission. Again, just to know that there is this kind of a process that is followed. Okay, right. So a beam of high-speed electrons, or even in some other experiments, they'll use neutrons also actually. In some of the nuclear physics experiments, you do that later, right? When they knock out free electrons from material, electrons from a metal. Okay. These ejected electrons are called secondary electrons. That's why the name secondary emission. Again, there will be some governing theories for this. We'll not be seeing them during our syllabus. And why I gave you all these pictures is that in JEE Advanced, there is chance that they might make a comprehension on these kind of things in JEE Advanced. That's why having a familiarity about this, and then on that day when you're reading in the exam, going through those things, and also these names at times are mentioned in NCERT, so they are part of your syllabus in JEE Mains, at least names wise, knowledge wise, you should know. That's the reason why we are taking up this page. Okay, just take a snapshot. We'll move forward to the most important part of our syllabus, that is the photoelectric emission. Okay, right, done. So the photoelectric emission, by now we have already given enough hype towards this topic, right? So I'll write it in one statement. Light of suitable frequency. What is suitable? How much is the value? We'll discuss. Suitable frequency when it falls on a metal surface, electrons come out. Now, unlike the thermionic emission where electrons come out with negligible kinetic energy, in this context, they found that electrons actually going to come out with a distribution of Ke values. That means different kinetic energies, distribution of kinetic energy values. Okay, so a lot of whys have to be answered, and that's what we are going to focus next. This was all the build up towards it. Why suitable frequency? How come metal surface can interact with this light and give out electrons, and why this distributed Ke values? So this is what we are going to explore. This is a simple picture of source of light falling on this, and electrons are ejected, and these electrons ejections are enhanced by supplying battery of either positive or negative values. So that is what is going to be our basic picture of a photoelectric emission. So from now onwards in our classwork, this entire word photoelectric emission, I'll use the short form PEE. Okay, so PEE effect or PEE experiment, I'll call it. So it's a short form from our classwork. It's not a standard one. So let me put a star on the top just to save time. Okay, right? So what we are going to do is we are going to see the Lenard's observations, and not just Lenard, many people's observations together, along with some of the experiments or experimental observations that Einstein made before he came up with the theory. Okay, so again, the simple sequence, as is the case with any physics, and more so in modern physics, we'll see first of all experimental observations of photoelectric emission effect or experiment. Observations will take conclusions, and then we'll try to explain it using a theory. Okay, experiments come first, observations and conclusions come next, and then the theory to explain whatever observations are made. Okay, so that's the sequence. Let's move forward. Okay, so the experimental setup of PEE and explanation by Einstein, will start with the experimental setup. Okay, so this picture I directly snapped from your NCRT so as to give you how that look of the experimental setup was. Okay, so let me explain very quickly on the right side of your screen. So you have the old quartz window that I already described. Light is coming into this, and this there will be certain light that would be filtered off here, so that you know that the frequency of light that would be used here would be of certain value. That's the reason why quartz window was used. Then this is the photosensitive metal plate. He's calling it as cathode. Okay, and the electrons would be ejected out, and these electrons ejected out can be having different types of kinetic energies. As I said already in the previous, some of them will have high values of Ke, and some of them will have very low values of Ke. In order to ensure that these electrons reach this plate called as anode, A stands for anode on the right side, we can apply a potential difference across these two pellets. Okay, right. And that potential difference polarity can be changed using this commutator circuit. This is called commutator. Any circuit which has two-way switch where you can change the polarity is called a commutator circuit. Okay, and this looks very complicated in your NCRT book, so you need to be, if you watch carefully, then you'll understand what Einstein or other people were doing here. Okay, so if I make the switch connection with this here, okay, then you're talking about the negative potential connected, and the current will actually flow like this into this microammeter and then come out from here. Okay, and if you connect the other side, the positive potential will be connected. So either switch this way or this way ensures the polarity change. Second important thing, by connecting any one of these switches, by moving the rheostat, can you see there is a rheostat here? By moving the value here, you can change the magnitude of the potential difference across these 2 points applied. Okay, so that's the basic use of a commutator. Okay, if someone gives this in the exam, don't get afraid. It's just a circuit which can change both magnitude and direction of the uh, electric field applied on the electrons. If electric field's direction is towards left in your picture, listen carefully. In this gap, if the electric field is leftwards, then electrons become faster towards right, and more electrons will be collected per unit time by this anode plate. If the electric field is towards right in the gap, then electrons slow down, and there is a chance that if it is increased, the electric field towards right is increased. That's called an opposing electric field, right? Then because force will act in the opposite direction, it's negatively charged. Then some of the electrons will not reach the anode plate, and there could be chance that no electron reaches the anode plate. How do you know whether high electrons are reaching or low number of electrons are reaching? You'll get it from the reading of this microammeter. It's a very small current compared to any of the previously done experiments. So the order of the current would be in microamperes. Okay, so it's a very sensitive experiment that he has done. For our understanding, and in most of our exam question papers, they won't give this diagram because it's highly confusing and also difficult to draw. So I've converted the diagram to a more basic looking diagram. Okay, right, which you can now draw in your notes. And this is how the diagram also will be most of the times printed in your question papers and exams. Okay, so but in order to ensure that this is a variable one, so let me put that variable part here. Okay, so this is the variable voltage, both in magnitude and direction, minus or plus. I'll write plus or minus. Okay, right. And some of the important things which even Thomson did at that point of time, let me label that. Always remember as much low density as possible. This should be a vacuum. Otherwise, ionization effects and all those collisions, once the air molecules are here and the electrons are colliding, your collection will be a problem. If the collection of electrons is a problem, this ammeter won't read a reading. Okay, right. So vacuum in real life means a low pressurized gas. Okay, and this anode is also in some books, and even I think in one of your NCRT questions, he calls this as collector cup because it collects the electrons, and it's having a cup shape actually. In most of the experiments, it's not shown here in this picture, but it will have a cup kind of a shape. This is the photosensitive metal or the anode. Here we use a different color. Photosensitive metal, also known as cathode in the experiment, usually. Okay, so this is the labeling of the diagram. And from this, we'll try to see what are the observations in graphs. We'll try to draw some graphs and then we'll move on to observe certain things in that graphs. Just take a picture, I'll move on. Okay, right, let's. Okay, so these are the observations. And I keep saying this, these observations are written not in chronological order, just to suit our syllabus and our NCRT textbook. The order in which the things are done are not actually what happened year after year. One more thing, these observations are not limited to only Lenard and Hallwards observations alone. Most of them are done by Lenard and Hallwards. Okay, so this graph especially was done by Lenard at that point of time. Okay, so Einstein developed the theory. Most of the experimental work was done by these two people during that period. Okay, so the first graph that they observed, Lenard observed that photoelectric current that he was recording. Okay, this graph again I picked up from NCRT where they mark. I wanted to highlight something very important. Okay, so if you see NCRT textbook, and most textbooks they do this, they mark photoelectric current on y-axis and they mark something. This is the slightly troublesome part. They write intensity of light and mark it on x-axis. Okay, let's try to first of all understand what this graph was trying to tell. Okay, so on the graph itself, let me write. This was done for uh, same metal during the experiment. Okay, right, and same frequency. This is very important. Okay, right, then what is meant by increasing the intensity of light? That means you're talking about, let's say, a red laser. Then the frequency is decided by the red color of that, whereas the intensity in this context is always this one. So whenever you see a graph or a name of intensity word in modern physics, or especially photoelectric effect, you should understand this intensity of light as intensity of incident electromagnetic radiation measured as number of photons per second. This is not the watt intensity. So let me understand IP versus, you should also think this as n dot. Okay, so let me write that on that also. This is called n dot in our classwork. Okay, right. What is n dot? Number of photons incident per second, or you can call this as capital N dot. I'll use small n dot for another thing. So let me write that here. N dot is number of photons incident per second, whereas the small letter I use is for this. Small n dot is number of photons incident on something per unit area per unit time. Here it didn't matter because the collector cup area was constant throughout. So whether you draw it for small n dot or capital N dot, it doesn't matter. But usually it's the small n dot that we discuss. So we are considering it as a graph of I subscript P means photoelectric current versus the number incident per unit area per unit time. There is another name given to that. It's called photon intensity. It's called photon intensity. Okay, right. One more name, let me write that on the bottom. It's also called as photon flux intensity, number that is falling on that per unit area. The word flux is always, so these are the words you should understand. In the photon theory that would be developed by Einstein later, you should realize that the actual light beam intensity in watt, this is called light beam intensity in watt per meter square. Okay, so let me write that it is watt per meter square. There is a name given to that so as to not confuse with photon intensity. That name is called watt intensity. So how do you know whether an examiner in the question paper is asking watt intensity or photon intensity? If it is not mentioned in the question paper and he's asking a question on photoelectric effect um, syllabus, then intensity, full stop. He didn't mention watt or photon. It should be taken as n dot only, photon intensity only. I'm changing intensity of light in a PEE experiment. Then it means I'm changing the number of photons per unit area that are falling per unit time on that material. I'm not changing the frequency of that. H nu is the energy of each photon. Okay, this is all the futuristic thing. Okay, so when these observations were being made by Leonard, he didn't know all of this. All this was later on proposed by Einstein. We'll write it again in the proposal or the theory later, but I didn't want to keep you waiting till the end of these observations. Okay, so that you should have a very good picture of what this graph is talking about. Okay, so throughout this graph, h nu was same. It's the n dot that was changed. And they saw this. This was graph one. Okay, just take a snapshot and we'll move forward. In numerical questions, I think it's very simple. In numerical questions, the units you have to check. If the answer, he says intensity of light is 50 watt per meter square, then he's talking about this. If he says intensity of light falling on that is the, he's talking about second inverse meter power minus 2, then he's talking about this. Numerical problems, it will never be an issue. But in theory questions, you should be very careful. Nothing is mentioned, it is always this red thing and not the white thing. This is actually very important for you people to digest because you people came from, let's say, electromagnetic waves and that chapter. There, the intensity means actually this white thing. That's the difficulty. And all this discrepancy is coming because people in those days wrote all those papers, journals, and textbooks using this as intensity. That's why, and we borrow from those books and journals, right? That's why this problem happens. So in your JE advanced paper, when photoelectric effect question is studied or being read by you, you should change your mindset. That is given thing. You can't argue at that time saying, okay, so sir, I thought intensity is this. No, that is a given thing and there should not be any discrepancy in the future. Okay, right. Let's move on. Graph one is done. The second important graph that all those physicists that working on this experiment were finding out was the photoelectric current versus the collector cup or collector plate potential. Okay, right? The potential could be varied, right? Remember that arbitrary graph that I drew? Okay, so let me bring that graph for your consideration so that you can. We're in graph 2, right? Yeah, we're here. Imagine I just put it in small size here. Let's lift this one up. Okay, just for your understanding of what is meant by the collector and what potential is talking about. So what he saw in this graph is there are two regions of this graph. One is the positive sides of the potential where this terminal would be taken positive. Collector plate potential, if this positive terminal is connected to this, that is this region. Okay, right? This is the positive side region. And then they reverse the polarity using that commutator circuit. They can reverse this polarity. And then this is the negative side region. Okay, lot of things went on in this particular graph. And remember, when I1, I2, and I3 are drawn, that means he's talking about the same metal plate being used in three different experiments with three different intensities of light. Okay, so let me write that down so that it's very clear. In graph 2, what they did was they took the same nu refers to frequency. This is pronounced as nu. Okay, and represents frequency. Please, in modern physics, these symbols keep coming. So if you are having a very bad handwriting, it's difficult. Even my handwriting is not very good. So, but at least I'll try my best. On the top of your screen, do you see that symbol? If I write, it's nu, whereas gamma will be written by me like this. Gamma also will be used extensively in both atomic and nuclear physics. So please, when you're writing in a subjective paper, especially in Olympiad, try to ensure that you write these two differently. Some of the people who can't take this risk, okay, that's why they use for nu F itself. Instead of H nu, they'll write HF. Okay, so either do that or try to show quite a difference between the nu and the gamma symbols. Okay, so just on the top I wrote. So he's talking about the same frequency but different end dots. The end dots of all these are different. Okay, all of them are red colored only, let's suppose, or maybe UV light of the same frequency, but the number of the UV photons falling per unit time on that particular material is changed. Okay, and for greater intensities, you could see for greater intensities, he got greater currents on the positive direction. Okay, right. This was the second observation. Not only that, one thing that is not given in your NCERT graph that I would like to highlight here, and I'll give the explanation later, is they saw that the potential, listen carefully to this, if the potential is increased continuously, you could see the more and more number of electrons are reaching that ammeter. Obviously, if you apply greater electric field here, more electrons reach here per unit time, and therefore the current keeps increasing. But you could see that current doesn't increase continuously. Even after reaching certain potential values, the current remains constant. So that type of current is called saturated current, and the potential at which this saturation occurs is given a name. Okay, so let me mark that in one of the experiments for I1's case, this potential at which current becomes saturated is called pinch in voltage. Okay, right. So let me write that observation here. A pinch in voltage was observed where photocurrent I subscript B becomes saturated. Okay, right. Then on the reverse side, they observed one more thing. If the this is called retarding potential. Why is that called retarding potential? That means the field is applied towards right and electrons will be retarded, or they will be opposed in their motion. And at some negative value of the potential, they saw not even a single electron is reaching this collector cup or collector plate, and therefore the current registered by this would be zero. Okay, right. So apart from pinch in voltage on the positive side, on the negative side, they observed something called as stopping potential. Okay, so a stopping potential Okay, remember the stopping potential in future would be referred to as the magnitude of the negative potential. Okay, minus V naught mod is put. Even though here in NCERT marked it like this, when someone asks you what is the stopping potential, you'll not put a minus in your answer. You just say this is the value. It is understood as the minus value. It's a magnitude of the negative potential. Okay, so is observed where current first becomes zero. That is, it's the minimum value. First becomes zero. So these are the observations. We'll all explain this using theory. We are taking down the observations. So this is the graph 2. Just take a snapshot and we'll move forward. Okay, right. Let's move to the graph 3 now. I'll just borrow this circuit so that I can keep explaining to graph 3. Okay, right. So if you carefully observe graph 3, right, what we are doing is now we are making sure the intensities are same, but the frequencies are changed. These are new, okay, right? This is the symbol new 3, new 2, new 1, which are frequency changes. Okay, so we are doing same metal plate, experiment done with same metal plate, not changing it, same n dot, that means number intensity or the photon flux density, whatever, all those numbers, n dot as I called it. But what is being changed? Different new values. It is frequencies. So that's what graph 3 was drawn for. In that they saw that the saturation current that you are ending up getting is the same. That means the value of different frequencies didn't affect the value of the final saturation current that was seen in graph 2. Okay, so we realize that saturation current was found to be dependent on n dot only and not frequency. Okay, it was not found to be dependent on frequency, whereas retarding potential was found to be dependent on frequency. Whereas retarding potential also, what was the name I gave in the last page? Let's use that, stopping potential. That minimum potential at which the current became zero was different for different things. Okay, so whereas stopping potential was found different / dependent on the value of nu. And here they found that if frequency was higher, listen carefully to this, we'll estimate that, we'll just observing the graph. Even Leonard did not know how to explain all this. Please understand that. He got a Nobel Prize just for confirming the experimental results. What he failed was he could not get the theory for explanation. So we are in the Leonard shoes right now. So he took what he got, that's it. So he found that greater frequencies required greater retarding potentials to have the ammeter show zero reading. If you want ammeter to show zero reading for a greater frequency experiment, you needed a greater reverse potential. This is what he saw. This was graph 3. No explanation. I think somewhere around in 1906, Leonard got, for all his work, right from I think 1800s, I don't even remember the year when he started. So that many years he put in the effort, and he did not even finish the theory also. But for experiments which gave insight to others, he got the Nobel Prize. Okay, so let's move forward. Graph 4. Now we change the metal. Okay, right. So we took two different metals, metal A and metal B. That is your cathode, left side, what we are using. And therefore, what they saw is different stopping potentials were found. Now the graph is, let me first of all understand what the graph is all about. Any photoelectric effect question in the paper, graph 1, please always look at what the graph is being drawn for. The graph is being drawn for a stopping potential versus frequency of the light that is used. Okay, right, frequency of light. And what does each of these mean? Let's understand what does this dot mean in this. This dot means when the experiment was being conducted for metal, for this particular frequency, this much stopping potential was needed. Then the experiment was stopped and again a new frequency was used. Let's say a dot here. A new frequency was used, then stopping potential changed. And that's what each of these dots mean. Actually, three such dots on this was these three maybe in the previous graph. Same metal, three different frequencies, three different potentials. He's showing it on a different graph paper. I hope you appreciate what he's doing. And he tried to repeat that again with a different metal. He got two parallel lines. That means from metal to metal, the graph between stopping potential to frequency was coming out to be parallel lines. That means the slope of this graph, or slope of stopping potential versus frequency, was independent of the material used, independent of the frequency used, independent of the intensity used. That means some universal constant is there that is hidden in this slope. This is what he thought at that point of time. No theory could support at that point of time this observation. Observation was right, but theory was not there to support it. So let me write down whatever he got as conclusions. Slope of graph of stopping potential V naught, that modulus of negative value, versus frequency, that nu, carefully written, was independent of lot of things. Name all the things that you could vary in the experiments. It was coming out to be independent. That means some universal constant was associated. So let's list of things that we could change. N dot, metal. You could change the frequency. You could change metal frequency. You could change the voltage that you are applying. Okay, right? So a lot of things, etc. It was universal constant. So some universal constant maybe. And universal constants were not new to them. Remember, Thomson had a universal constant associated in his experiments. Millikan later on gave us a universal constant called E by M. Okay, and E. Sorry, E by M came from Thomson's experiments, and E came from Millikan's experiment. And combining these two, we could estimate mass of electron. Mass of electron, we don't have a separate experiment. Mass is very difficult to estimate. Charges react to electric and magnetic fields, right? So these two, this is the sequence actually. If chronology is asked by anyone, what is the sequence in which E by M, E and M are discovered? This is the sequence of these universal constants. So this is not new. So they were predicting something inside this. Okay, so some universal constant, maybe. This is what they thought at that point of time. So this was graph 4. So let's move forward. Graph 5 and last one, I guess, before we take a break. So V naught stopping potential was drawn here, and then intensity was put. What was the previous graph? Let's go back and check a bit. Okay, so this was for frequency. Now he's drawing it for intensity, just to confirm that it's not going to depend on intensity. So for different frequencies, we should get different stopping potentials. But within an experiment of a frequency, you keep changing intensity. The value of stopping potential was not dependent on it. Okay, so that was another one. So stopping potential is independent of intensity. When I say intensity in PEE setup, You all know I'm talking about n dot. Okay, right. Not only that, I think from the previous graph itself, graph 3 itself, you can tell this, no? Greater intensities have greater stopping potentials. We saw that here also. You see? Not, no, sorry, greater frequency, I should say. Sorry, slip of tongue. This one was very evident. Greater frequencies had greater stopping potentials. So in this, if this was a higher value, I think I should be able to write and you will be able to accept it, at least based on the previous graph, that this should be the order. Can you see? This should be the order. Okay, so this was the fifth observation or the fifth graph that they drew. Final observation, which was not graphical, was also very, very important, which completely put rest to the wave theory. Wave theory could not come up with any plausible explanation for most of the previous 5 observations, most of them. Some of them it could, some of them it couldn't. But the final conclusion of the 6th observation was completely against the wave theory. Okay, so let me write that before we conclude the class. Electrons in photoelectric effect experiment or phenomena were emitted as soon as light was incident on it. That means the effect was instantaneous nearly. Okay, right? Whereas the wave theory predicts if at all electrons have to emit, there should be a time lag. Okay, right? So that's what we are going to look at in the lecture 2 after the break. So where the failure of wave theory to explain the observations in PE experiment, and one of the failures is to be not able to explain why the photoelectric effect is instantaneous. And they saw this right from the start. Remember that Leonard's observations, Hallwash's observation, remember that gold leaf electroscope observations. I'll put some videos and the links in the description below or to your WhatsApp group after the class is over. Any of the photoelectric effect experiments, you see the effect is instantaneous. The gold leaves will fall or diverge instantaneously once you put the light. You don't take time. Okay, so that's what we are going to list out, which parts of the observations the wave theory fails, and therefore whenever a theory fails, you need a person or a theory to explain the observations, and that's how we'll go forward in the lecture 2. Okay, so just stay back, I'll announce the time. You take a snapshot of this, or you might have noted down 6th one. 5 graphs and 1 observation. Okay, so this is the start of our next lecture.